Imagine walking into a company, a church, a government office, a police unit, a startup, a family, or even a nation. And on day one, nobody hands you a manual titled, "Welcome, here's how we lie, cut corners, protect favorites, stay silent, and pretend this is normal." No, that would be too obvious, too cinematic, too honest. Real corruption is usually not announced with drums. It arrives wearing a tie. It smiles in meetings. It says things like, "That's just how we do things here. Don't be difficult. Be a team player. It's not ideal, but it works. Let's not overreact." And that, right there, is how culture begins to write people. Because culture is not just what people say they believe. Culture is what gets praised, tolerated, repeated, and protected. And if you stay long enough in the wrong environment, your conscience can slowly be retrained like a house pet, not with one dramatic betrayal, but with 1,000 tiny permissions. Today, we are going deep into one of the most powerful invisible forces on Earth: culture design. How a culture forms, why it becomes stronger than policy, and how it can silently normalize bad behavior until people no longer feel bad doing what would have shocked them a year ago. And here is the terrifying part. Sometimes the people inside the culture are not monsters. Sometimes they are just adapted. Let's go into the machinery. What culture actually is. Most people think culture is vibes. Snacks in the break room, matching t-shirts, a mission statement in Helvetica, a CEO saying, "We're like family," which is usually the corporate equivalent of seeing a crocodile smile. But Edgar Schein argued that culture is much deeper than surface symbols. He described it as a pattern of shared assumptions a group learns as it solves problems, then teaches to newcomers as the correct way to think and behave. Leaders shape it heavily through what they pay attention to, reward, measure, and punish. That means culture is not mainly posters on the wall. Culture is the unwritten operating system. It tells people what is actually important here, what gets rewarded here, what gets ignored here, who gets protected here, what truths are dangerous here, and what lies are profitable here. A company might say, "We value integrity," but if the liar gets promoted, the manipulator gets protected, the quiet coward gets called mature, and the whistleblower mysteriously disappears like socks in a washing machine, then congratulations, you do not have an integrity culture. You have a performance theater with moral fog machines. Culture is not your slogan. Culture is your pattern. Now let's talk about formation, because culture does not fall from heaven like rain. It is designed, sometimes intentionally, often accidentally. A culture usually forms through 5 forces. 1. Repetition. Whatever happens over and over begins to feel normal. Humans are adaptation machines. We get used to almost anything. A late start becomes how mornings work. Rude leadership becomes high standards. Favoritism becomes trust. Fear becomes professionalism. Silence becomes wisdom. Do something once and people notice. Do it 50 times and people stop seeing it. 2. Reward. People do what pays. Not what the handbook says, what pays. If honesty costs you influence and flattery gets you access, guess what grows? Not honesty, flattery with abs. Schein's framework is brutal here. Leaders teach culture by what they focus on, measure, reward, and control. So if a leader says, "We care about people," but only celebrates numbers, speed, loyalty, and obedience, then the real sermon has already been preached, and everybody heard it. 3. Selection. Cultures reproduce themselves by choosing who gets in, who rises, and who survives. Healthy cultures recruit character. Toxic cultures recruit compliance.
Eventually, the wrong people feel at home, and the right people feel like they're allergic to oxygen. 4. Story. Every culture has legends. The founder who never slept, the manager who did what it took, the guy who bent the rules and saved the quarter, the woman who kept quiet and showed wisdom. Stories are not decoration, they are moral software. They tell people what kind of behavior becomes heroic. 5. Protection. This is the final seal. A culture hardens when certain people become untouchable. Once a system protects its high performers more than its stated values, decay begins wearing a badge. Now bad behavior is not just happening, it is being defended. And once evil gets HR support, calendar invites, and executive language, it becomes very difficult to challenge. How bad culture hides itself. Here is one of the cleverest things culture does. It makes vice sound reasonable. Nobody says, let us now normalize deception. No, that would be cartoon villain behavior. Instead, they say, we need alignment, we need efficiency, we need discretion, we need unity, we need urgency, we need results. Now notice something important. Those words are not evil words. That is why culture is dangerous. Bad culture doesn't always arrive through openly bad language. It often hijacks good language. It uses the vocabulary of order to excuse control, the vocabulary of excellence to excuse abuse, the vocabulary of loyalty to excuse silence, the vocabulary of wisdom to excuse cowardice. So the culture becomes a translator. It takes ugly behavior and gives it a respectable accent. Fear becomes discipline. Manipulation becomes leadership. Image management becomes strategy. Silence becomes maturity. Compromise becomes realism. And by the time everybody is fluent in the dialect, nobody remembers what plain truth sounded like. The normalization of deviance. Now we enter the deep chamber. There is a phrase that perfectly describes how cultures slowly make wrong things feel acceptable: normalization of deviance. NASA and safety scholars use the term to describe the gradual process by which unacceptable behavior or standards, repeated without catastrophic consequence, start to look normal. NASA also explicitly connects the idea to the Challenger and Columbia disaster lessons. This is one of the most important ideas you will ever learn, because most systems do not collapse the first time they cheat. The first shortcut works. The first lie helps. The first red flag passes. The first compromise saves time. The first silence keeps peace. And because lightning doesn't strike immediately, people begin to believe the behavior is safe. Then the abnormal becomes familiar. The familiar becomes acceptable. The acceptable becomes expected. And the expected becomes defended. That is normalization of deviance. Not because the behavior became good, because the people became used to it. That is how a team starts ignoring warning signs. That is how a police unit starts cutting corners. That is how a finance team starts bending numbers. That is how a ministry starts worshiping image. That is how a family starts protecting dysfunction. That is how a nation starts calling corruption smartness. Not through one dramatic fall, through repeated survival after small betrayals. The human brain is always making one dangerous bargain. If it didn't destroy us last time, maybe it's not that bad. History is full of graves built on that sentence. Why good people join in. Now someone is watching this and thinking, surely people know when something is wrong. Sometimes they do, and they still go along. Why? Because people are not influenced only by truth. They are influenced by incentives, belonging, fear, fatigue, and status. Let me translate that into plain language. A person may know something is wrong, but also know that speaking up will cost them friends, income, access, promotion, safety, or identity. And most people do not betray truth because they love evil. They betray truth because they fear exile. That is why culture is stronger than personal opinion. A room can retrain a person. A system can dull disgust. A tribe can edit morality. A repeated environment can make a once clear conscience start negotiating with nonsense. You see this everywhere. The new employee says, "Wait, why do we do it this way?" And everyone laughs the laugh of people who have buried their better selves. They say, "You'll understand." And often, eventually, they do, which is tragic, because "you'll understand" means you too will be reshaped. Now let's get surgical. Culture forms fastest through leadership signals, not just speeches, signals.
Who gets interrupted? Who gets corrected? Who gets promoted? Who gets protected? What gets measured? What gets ignored? What gets punished instantly? What gets excused repeatedly? MIT Sloan's summary of SHINE is very direct. Leaders shape culture by what they consistently focus on, how they allocate rewards and resources, and the criteria they use for hiring, promotion, and dismissal. So let me say this plainly. If a leader rewards output without ethics, they are designing a dangerous culture. If a leader punishes dissent more than dishonesty, they are designing a dangerous culture. If a leader protects loyal offenders and sacrifices honest critics, they are designing a dangerous culture. If a leader says one thing and celebrates another, they are not confused. They are coding the system, and everybody is downloading the update. That is why tone at the top matters so much in integrity and compliance research. Misconduct is not just an individual failure, it is often a systemic failure shaped by incentives, oversight, and leadership example. OECD materials repeatedly frame misconduct as rooted in internal systems, prevention structures, and leadership accountability rather than isolated bad apples. Which means this is not merely about bad people, it is about bad design. The 3 stages of cultural decay. Here's a simple model. Stage 1. What is wrong is visible. At first, people still feel tension. They whisper, they frown, they say, "This isn't right." Conscience is alive. Stage 2. What is wrong becomes useful. Now the wrong thing gets results. The manipulator closes deals. The bully drives performance. The liar protects the brand. The fixer saves time. Now people stop asking, "Is it right?" They start asking, "Does it work?" This is where many cultures sell their soul for efficiency. Stage 3. What is wrong becomes identity. Now the system says, "This is who we are. This is how winners move. This is how serious people operate. This is what maturity looks like." At this point, the culture no longer merely commits the behavior, it moralizes it. And once a culture turns vice into virtue, reform becomes very expensive, because now you are not just fighting habits, you are fighting a worldview. Examples everybody recognizes. Let's make this painfully practical. A startup begins with hustle, then hustle becomes permanent chaos, then chaos becomes poor planning, then poor planning becomes burnout, then burnout becomes a badge of honor. Now dysfunction is wearing sneakers and calling itself innovation. A church begins with spiritual authority, then authority becomes centralization, then centralization becomes fear, then fear becomes silence, then silence becomes honor. Now control is wearing a scripture reference. A sales team begins with ambition, then ambition becomes pressure, then pressure becomes exaggeration, then exaggeration becomes deception, then deception becomes managing the narrative. Now lying is wearing cologne and carrying a quarterly target.
A government office begins with procedure, then procedure becomes bureaucracy, then bureaucracy becomes opacity, then opacity becomes impunity. Now corruption is wearing official stamps and asking for something small. That, my friend, is how culture works. It does not need everybody to become evil. It only needs enough people to become comfortable. Warning signs of a bad culture. Here are the warning signs that a culture is going rotten. When people fear telling the truth upward. When results excuse character failure. When nobody can define the real rules, but everybody somehow knows them. When dissent is treated as betrayal. When image matters more than substance. When exceptions keep getting made for the important people. When jokes are used to smuggle cruelty into normal conversation. When everyone says, "That's above my pay grade," as if conscience were a premium subscription. And perhaps the biggest sign of all, when something feels wrong to everybody privately, but normal publicly. That means the culture is no longer merely shared, it is enforced. Now, let's not leave this in darkness. A good culture can also be designed, not perfectly, but deliberately. Here is how. 1. Reward what you actually want repeated. Do not praise values in theory and reward the opposite in practice. If honesty matters, reward honesty. If accountability matters, apply it upward too. If respect matters, make it visible in meetings, not just websites. 2. Make truth safe. If people can only tell the truth when it is convenient, you do not have a truth culture. You have a performance culture with occasional honesty breaks. People need to know they can raise problems without social assassination. 3. Punish protected misconduct. The soul of a culture is revealed by what happens when a high-status person breaks the rules. If the rules evaporate around rank, then the values were decorative. 4. Name drift early. Don't wait until a compromise becomes identity. Catch it when it is still small. Small rot is cheaper than structural collapse. 5. Train people in moral language. A lot of bad cultures win because good people lack vocabulary. They feel discomfort but cannot name manipulation. They sense pressure but cannot identify coercion. They notice drift but cannot describe it. Give people language and you give them sight. 6. Build memory. Healthy cultures remember why rules exist. Unhealthy cultures inherit procedures without story, then break them for convenience. Memory protects meaning. Meaning protects discipline. The personal question. Now let's turn the knife inward, because this is not only about companies, governments, churches, and teams. This is also about us. Every human being is a mini-culture. You have patterns, you have permissions, you have repeated thoughts that have become normal, you have compromises that no longer shock you. So the question is not just, what culture am I in? The deeper question is, what am I normalizing? What have you repeated so often that you no longer examine it? What lie have you renamed wisdom? What fear have you renamed caution? What pride have you renamed standards? What silence have you renamed peace? Because culture is not only external architecture, it is internal formation. And many people want a better future while secretly rehearsing the habits that create the same old world. So here's the final truth. Culture is built in whispers before it appears in headlines. It forms in repeated moments, tiny permissions, little silences, small rewards, quiet protections, unchallenged stories. And one day, people wake up inside a system they would have condemned when it was still small. That is why culture must be designed on purpose, because if you don't design it, drift will. If you don't guard it, incentives will. If you don't correct it, repetition will. If you don't confront bad behavior early, familiarity will baptize it. And once familiarity blesses what truth once warned against, people stop resisting. They adapt. Never underestimate the power of what a group repeats. It can turn courage into awkwardness. It can turn compromise into policy. It can turn silence into survival. And it can turn wrong into normal. But the reverse is also true. A brave culture can make honesty contagious. A disciplined culture can make integrity visible. A healthy culture can make courage feel ordinary. And that, my friend, is one of the greatest designs a leader, a parent, a pastor, a founder, or a nation can ever build. Because the strongest culture is not the one that gets people to obey in public. It is the one that trains people to love what is right, even when nobody is watching. If this hit you, type this in the comments. Normal is not always right. And if you want, I can turn this into a higher retention YouTube version